The autumn wind carried a sharp bite that Thursday morning, and salt from the Atlantic Ocean hung heavy in the air as the transport vessel made its slow approach to the Virginia coastline. 47 women, all of them German nationals who had been seized during the Allied advance through France and Belgium, and even within the crumbling borders of the Reich itself, stood pressed together on the upper deck of the SS Bremen. Their thin coats offered little protection against the chill, and they pulled them tighter around their bodies as the ship's engines throttled down and the massive harbour came into view. Everything they had been taught, every briefing they had received from their superiors, every broadcast they had absorbed from the propaganda ministry, had painted America as a nation weakened by luxury and incapable of sustaining a real war effort. The scene unfolding before their eyes would begin dismantling that carefully constructed illusion within moments of their arrival. Sound reached them first, even before the details became clear. A persistent metallic rhythm echoed across the water, the striking of hammers against steel plates creating a noise like distant church bells, but without pause or mercy. Diesel machinery coughed and growled somewhere beyond the docks, and the acrid smell of tar mingled with hot metal and ocean brine in a combination that assaulted their senses. For women who had spent years under rationing, under scarcity, under the slow starvation of resources that had become routine in wartime Germany, the sheer volume of activity was disorienting. One among them, a woman named Ingrid who had kept a small diary hidden in her belongings, would later write that they had anticipated finding a harbour emptied by war, perhaps a few vessels scattered along the waterfront. Instead, what stretched before them was a concentration of ships that exceeded even Hamburg's busiest pre-war days. The contradiction could not have been more stark or more immediate. These women, many of them trained as technicians and support personnel who understood logistics and production capacity, had crossed the ocean expecting to witness a society hollowed out by conflict. What greeted them instead, before they had even set foot on American ground, was evidence of a war-making apparatus that operated on a scale beyond anything they could have imagined. The Norfolk Naval Yard alone kept more than 40,000 workers employed, and those workers were launching a cargo vessel every 4 days without fail. By the time the global conflict would finally end, American shipyards across the nation would have produced 2,700 Liberty ships alone. That single category of vessel represented production that dwarfed Germany's entire maritime construction throughout the war. A naval officer in American uniform, a lieutenant whose bearing was professional without being cruel, guided them down the gangplank as it was lowered into place. His manner was correct, almost formal, yet there was no hostility in his voice, and that peculiar civility unsettled them in ways that open antagonism might not have. The sound of their boots striking the dock planks echoed hollowly beneath the larger symphony of industrial noise, and their eyes darted constantly between the lines of American soldiers standing in relaxed formation and the endless background tableau of cranes swinging cargo nets, welders sending showers of sparks into the air, and partially assembled vessels rising from their berths like the skeletons of great beasts. Among the German prisoners, silence settled heavy and oppressive, broken only by shuffling feet and the relentless percussion of shipyard work. For the Americans going about their daily tasks, this was merely another routine arrival. For the captured women, each moment revealed something that challenged everything they thought they understood about their enemy. They began noticing details that seemed insignificant individually, but accumulated into an overwhelming impression. A convoy of military trucks sat idling near one of the warehouses, their fuel tanks obviously full, their canvas covers new and unstained. Pallets stacked with fresh uniforms rose waist-high along one section of the dock. To people who had been carefully measuring out soap and sugar since 1940, who had learned to make a single egg stretch across 3 days of meals, these casual displays of abundance spoke to resources they could barely comprehend. One prisoner, her voice barely audible above the industrial cacophony, whispered in German that this could not possibly be real. Another woman pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, though whether against the physical cold or against something more unsettling was unclear. What they were witnessing had not been arranged for their benefit, had not been staged as some elaborate performance designed to impress or intimidate them. This was simply how America conducted its daily business in wartime, and that realization disturbed them more profoundly than any propaganda film they might have seen. A Red Cross observer, present to ensure that the treatment of prisoners adhered to international agreements, made a notation in his records that the women appeared disoriented not primarily by their capture or their current status as prisoners, but rather by the simple fact of their arrival in this place. The docks themselves, he wrote, seemed to communicate a form of power that transcended military force. As the women were directed toward the waiting buses that would transport them inland, they caught one final panoramic view of the harbour stretching toward the horizon. Ship masts and industrial smokestacks pierced the sky in such density that they resembled an iron forest, and that image would remain burned into their memories. But their journey into the heart of American industrial power had only just begun. The road ahead would carry them past evidence even more staggering than what they had witnessed at the waterfront, and with each passing mile, the gap between what they had been taught to believe and what they could now see with their own eyes would widen until it became a chasm impossible to ignore. The vehicles pulled away from Norfolk shortly after midday, flanked by a pair of military jeeps that served as escort. The buses themselves wore the standard olive paint of military transport, and their windows bore the cloudy residue of dried salt spray. Inside, the German women sat without speaking, their attention drawn irresistibly to the landscape rolling past outside. They had expected poverty, perhaps even devastation. Instead, mile after mile revealed an arsenal that seemed to have no ending. The first jolt to their assumptions came within minutes of leaving the harbour area behind. Shipyards extended along the coastline for what seemed like blocks, with smoke and steam rising from construction gantries where welders created cascades of sparks against the grey afternoon sky. Rows upon rows of Liberty ships stood in various stages of completion, some consisting of nothing more than skeletal frames and hull plates, while others appeared nearly ready for their launch ceremonies. A young signals officer among the prisoners, someone who had studied naval tonnage tables as part of her training, murmured in disbelief that this single yard contained more hulls under construction than existed in all of Kiel. The numbers, had she known them, would have confirmed her instinctive assessment. Norfolk by itself was producing dozens of destroyers, aircraft carriers, and auxiliary vessels throughout 1944. Across the entire United States, shipyards were generating 18 million tons of shipping annually, a figure that represented 6 times Germany's total wartime maritime output. The rhythm of hammers and pneumatic rivet guns penetrated the bus windows like the pulse of some vast mechanical heart. As the convoy moved further from the coast, the character of the landscape shifted from docks to factories. Smokestacks punctuated the horizon at regular intervals. Warehouses sprawled across acres of land, their walls stenciled with company names that the women recognized only vaguely from intercepted American documents and intelligence reports. Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. One prisoner would later recall in her written account that it appeared as though every town had been transformed into a military installation, every street into a supply corridor. In that moment, she wrote, they understood that their own newspapers had been lying to them systematically. This was not a soft population distracted by comforts and divided by internal quarrels. This was a nation that had organized itself for war without losing the character of home. The paradox deepened with each mile the convoy travelled. Even the roads themselves seemed to form part of the revelation. The highways carried continuous streams of trucks loaded with wooden crates, with tanks secured to flatbed trailers, with machinery and spare parts covered by tarps. Gasoline, so precious in Germany that physicians had taken to riding bicycles to reach their patients, flowed freely here and fueled this ceaseless movement of men and materials. The women could smell it when the convoy slowed for traffic, that sharp, sweet odour of petrol fumes hanging in the warm autumn air. One of the American drivers, a sergeant named James Foster, chuckled quietly when he overheard a prisoner gasp at the sight of hundreds of trucks lined up nose to tail at a supply depot. Under his breath, though loud enough for his companion to hear, he muttered that this represented maybe half of what was actually on the roads at any given moment. For him, the sight held no particular significance. For them, it represented something that should not have been possible. At a designated rest stop outside Newport News, the buses pulled over and idled beside a rail yard. There, long trains of boxcars and flatbed cars stood ready for loading, each one marked with white chalk notations indicating its destination: Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Cranes lifted wooden crates stamped with serial numbers and military classifications, and the sheer orderliness of the operation struck the women as deeply unnerving. In the Reich, chaos had become the norm. Bombing raids disrupted shipment schedules constantly. Material shortages forced engineers to improvise solutions. Communication breakdowns meant that supplies arrived late or not at all. Here, the logistics appeared clean and efficient and relentless in their precision. The prisoners exchanged glances without speaking, silently taking inventory of what they were seeing. Several among them had received training as analysts, their value to Berlin tied directly to their ability to assess industrial capacity from observable details. What they now observed, the frequency of train movements, the volume of materials being transferred, the methodical stockpiling of goods in organized warehouses, all of this suggested an enemy whose resource base made their own look pitiful by comparison. One woman pulled out a small notebook and scribbled an entry that would later be recovered by American intelligence officers. "We believed America was a nation of consumers," she wrote. "It is in fact a nation of producers, and every factory we pass represents another nail being driven into our coffin." Yet paradoxically, no one seemed to be making a show of this abundance. American civilians along the route went about their ordinary lives. Workers in coveralls walked to and from their shifts. Children played games by the roadside. Women carried bags of groceries from local shops. There was no visible sense of strain or imminent collapse, none of the hollow-eyed exhaustion that had become the defining characteristic of German cities by 1944. Instead, a sense of vitality seemed to radiate from the streets themselves. The prisoners found themselves unable to reconcile the contradiction. Here was a nation waging war across multiple continents and 2 oceans simultaneously, yet still managing to feed its population adequately, still clothing them in decent fabric, still constructing highways and bridges as though peacetime had never ended. By the time the convoy approached the outskirts of Richmond, the women had fallen into complete silence. The shock that had struck them at the harbour had transformed into something deeper and more corrosive, a gnawing realization that what they had witnessed in the span of a single afternoon exceeded what Germany could produce in a year. Their faith in the propaganda they had absorbed, the message that America was soft and incapable and fragmented by internal divisions, was dissolving like morning frost under the Virginia sun. But their education was far from complete. Ahead lay the internment camps themselves, the processing centres where paradoxically their captors would treat them with a level of dignity and consideration they had not anticipated. And within that treatment, yet another revelation awaited them. The buses turned off the main highway as dusk began to settle, gravel crunching beneath their tyres as they approached an extensive compound surrounded by barbed wire fencing. The women braced themselves instinctively, preparing for filth and overcrowding and brutality. German propaganda broadcasts had characterized American prisoner of war facilities as little better than outdoor cages where captured soldiers were left to suffer. But as the main gates swung open, another contradiction presented itself. The barracks visible before them resembled a university campus more than a prison. Neat rows of wooden buildings stood in orderly alignment, their roofs freshly tarred against the weather. Smoke curled from brick chimneys, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of baking bread from a nearby mess hall. Beyond the sleeping quarters stretched tidy garden plots and an open field marked with lines for recreational activities. One woman, a trained nurse named Hildegard, muttered under her breath that this was impossible, that these people were being housed better than German soldiers at the front. Inside the processing facility, the shock only intensified. Each prisoner received an identification number, was photographed for administrative records, and was issued clean bedding. Then came the medical inspection. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a Navy physician assigned to the facility, conducted examinations with brisk efficiency. She checked teeth for signs of decay, listened to lungs for respiratory issues, and made notes about malnutrition in nearly every case she examined. Through an interpreter, she informed one prisoner that, judging from the physical evidence, they had been surviving on approximately 1,200 calories per day, perhaps even less. Our own soldiers, she added, received twice that amount even under field conditions. For the German women, the contrast was humiliating in its starkness. Back in their homeland, rations had dwindled to thin slices of dark bread, ersatz coffee made from roasted grain, and watery stews that contained more water than vegetables. Here, even captured enemies were being measured for properly fitting shoes and vaccinated against communicable diseases. Ingrid would later write in her journal that the Americans treated them like patients rather than enemies, and that this represented both an insult and a mercy simultaneously. The paradox extended beyond food and medical care. That evening, as the women were led to their assigned barracks, they found clean cots waiting for them, each one equipped with wool blankets. Soap and towels had been stacked in neat piles beside the communal washroom. A representative from the Red Cross explained through an interpreter that under the terms of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to basic standards of dignity and humane treatment. The Germans stared in collective disbelief. Their own government had signed those same international agreements, yet Soviet and French prisoners held in Reich custody were starving in open-air compounds, where shelter consisted of nothing more than muddy ground. Statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In American prison camps, German prisoners of war received an average of 3,500 calories daily, a ration that exceeded what many American civilians consumed under wartime rationing programs. In German camps, by contrast, Allied prisoners often subsisted on fewer than 1,000 calories. One prisoner confessed in a hushed whisper to her neighbour that if Berlin ever learned the truth about how well they were surviving in captivity, they would never be forgiven for it. The sensory details carved themselves into memory with particular force. The smell of genuinely clean sheets, the taste of white bread served with real butter at the evening meal, the metallic clatter of stainless steel cutlery against ceramic plates. Each element represented symbols of plenty that seemed obscene given the circumstances. In one corner of the dining hall, a prisoner broke down, sobbing after biting into a fresh orange, a fruit she had not seen since before the war began. To us, she whispered to no one in particular, this qualified as luxury beyond all reasonable measure. Yet the treatment they received was not indulgence for its own sake. It represented discipline and adherence to international law. Guards maintained strict order, and any attempt at escape would not be tolerated. But the very civility of the system functioned as its own form of weapon, a subtle demonstration of American confidence. As one United States officer remarked to a colleague within earshot of several prisoners, "We can afford to treat them well because we are not afraid of them." The women lay awake that first night in captivity, listening to the low mechanical hum of an electrical generator and the distant barking of guard dogs on patrol. For some among them, it represented the first uninterrupted night of rest they had experienced in months. For others, the experience brought a different kind of torment. To be shown humanity by the enemy made it increasingly difficult to justify the brutality their own regime had normalized. But what they had witnessed thus far, the harbour installations, the highway infrastructure, the condition of the barracks, represented only the surface level of American power. Soon they would hear something else, voices crackling across open radio frequencies and telephone lines, revealing a dimension of coordination that defied everything they thought they understood about wartime communications. The morning routine began with roll call, the clear notes of a bugle cutting through the autumn air. After breakfast, which consisted of scrambled eggs, toasted bread, and hot coffee that tasted like luxury itself, the prisoners were escorted into a common assembly hall. There, for the first time, they heard something they had been taught could not possibly exist in a properly run military operation: the open pulse of American communications infrastructure. Radio sets hummed with carrier waves. Telephones rang at intervals. The steady mechanical clatter of typewriters filled the background. For women who had received training in signal operations, radar systems, and logistics coordination, the soundscape itself constituted a revelation. They leaned forward instinctively, their attention sharpened by professional interest. Through the static of a shortwave receiver came voices speaking in clipped English, broadcasting weather updates from Kansas, reading shipping manifests originating in New Orleans, coordinating naval traffic movements off the Pacific coast. The truly astonishing element was not simply the breadth of information flowing through these channels, but rather how unguarded it all seemed to be. One of the Germans, a former radio operator named Lotte, whispered to her neighbour that they were not even bothering to conceal it, that they broadcast information to the world because they could afford to do so. In the Reich, secrecy governed everything. Telephone lines were tapped as a matter of routine. Communication codes were layered and cloaked in multiple encryptions. Paranoia dictated the character of every transmission. Here, the openness felt both confusing and terrifying in its implications. A United States Army sergeant, noticing the women's rapt attention to the communications equipment, explained in a casual tone that this represented merely routine administrative traffic. "We have thousands of stations," he told them, "thousands of telephone lines connecting every state, every military base, every ship at sea. The entire system is interconnected." He shrugged as though describing something entirely unremarkable. But for the prisoners, the scale was staggering. Germany's fragmented communications networks, crippled by sustained bombing campaigns and constant material shortages, could barely maintain contact across its shrinking empire. The comparison was devastating. Statistics confirmed what the women were beginning to grasp intuitively. By 1944, the United States operated more than 400,000 telephones dedicated to military service alone, with civilian telephone lines numbering in the tens of millions. In stark contrast, the Reich maintained fewer than 2 million functioning telephone connections, with many of those concentrated in cities that had already been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The prisoners were permitted to send letters home under Red Cross supervision. Some even dictated messages to American clerks who typed them on clean stationery using proper typewriters. Ingrid recorded in her journal later that to touch a telephone receiver, to witness a letter being processed and carried freely through the postal system, made her feel as though she were touching civilization again. And yet, she noted, this freedom of communication was precisely what they had been taught to despise as weakness. The paradox cut sharply. The generosity of their captors highlighted the bankruptcy of their own regime's promises. The sensory experience reinforced the lesson at every turn. The steady background buzz of switchboard operations. The metallic snap of plugs being inserted into jacks. The constant mechanical whir of paper feeding through teletype machines. It formed a symphony of efficiency that never paused. The women came to realize that this invisible infrastructure represented as decisive a weapon as tanks or aircraft. Wars were not fought exclusively with rifles and artillery. They were won through coordination and communication and the ability to move information as rapidly as materials. Hildegard, the nurse, would later confess in a post-war interview that she had believed America to be disorganized and lazy and lacking in discipline. Instead, she discovered that even their voices possessed order. The war existed in every telephone line, in every radio wave transmitted. It was inescapable and omnipresent. but the Americans were not showing off or making any special effort to impress their prisoners. To them, this represented routine administration, the ordinary machinery of daily operations. The very normalcy of it rattled the prisoners more than any deliberate intimidation could have. If this represented the background noise of a single camp in Virginia, what must the full communications network of the United States sound like when operating at full capacity? That evening, as the women returned to their barracks in formation, the weight of the paradox pressed heavily upon them. They had arrived as captured soldiers expecting humiliation and harsh treatment. Instead, they were being given glimpses of a system so vast in its scope that it appeared casual in the exercise of its power. For the Reich, secrecy had always functioned as armor, as protection against weakness. For America, transparency seemed to represent strength, and soon the evidence of that strength would become even more tangible and visible. Their next journey would take them into aircraft hangars, where the scale of American air power would manifest itself in ways that numbers on paper could never convey. The first sensation that struck them was the smell, thick and pervasive, composed of oil and rubber and aviation gasoline, a scent so powerful it seemed to cling to their clothing long after they departed. The convoy of buses came to a stop beside an enormous hangar constructed from corrugated metal, its massive doors standing open like the jaws of some colossal creature. Inside, wings gleamed under banks of overhead lamps. Aircraft engines hung suspended from crane chains. Teams of mechanics swarmed over fuselages with movements that appeared almost choreographed in their precision. For the German women, most of them raised on stories of Luftwaffe superiority and technological advantage, the sight administered another profound shock. In their understanding of the war, German aircraft, the Messerschmitts and Junkers and Focke-Wulfs, remained unmatched in quality and performance. Yet here stood rows of American bombers and fighter planes, not hidden away in precious secrecy, but displayed openly by the dozens, perhaps by the hundreds, as though their abundance made concealment unnecessary. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, assigned to escort the prisoner group, walked them down the length of the hangar floor. He was a cheerful Irish-American with grease stains on his sleeves, and no apparent sense that he was revealing anything particularly sensitive. Slapping the flank of a B-24 Liberator bomber with casual familiarity, he informed them that this particular aircraft could be replaced within 3 days if it were lost in combat. 3 days, ladies, he repeated. That is how quickly we produce them. The words landed with greater impact than any explosive device. 3 days. In Germany, aircraft factories were being systematically shattered by Allied bombing raids. Spare parts had become desperately scarce. Engines often required weeks to assemble when components were available at all. Some aircraft were being cannibalized simply to keep others operational. Here, the notion that a lost bomber represented merely a line item to be filled on a production schedule staggered them completely. Numbers substantiated O'Brien's casual boast. During 1944 alone, the United States manufactured 96,000 aircraft, a total that exceeded Germany's production across the entire duration of the war. At peak output, a new airplane rolled off American assembly lines somewhere in the country every 5 minutes without interruption. The contrast was obscene in its magnitude. The sensory details made the reality undeniable. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed through the hangar like sustained machine gun fire, except that instead of causing destruction, it was creating power. The air shimmered with heat radiating from arc welding equipment. Mechanics shouted instructions to one another over the roar of engines being tested at full throttle. The concrete floor itself vibrated with the pulse of industry. One of the prisoners, Lotta the radio operator, muttered audibly that there were so many aircraft here, and still more being constructed continuously. Her voice trembled not from fear of the guards surrounding them, but from the sheer magnitude of what her eyes were processing. Hildegard, the nurse, would confess in her journal that their leaders had told them America was weak and unwilling to accept sacrifice. Yet here, sacrifice seemed to be invisible because it had been industrialized. Production had replaced desperation. What disturbed them most profoundly was the casualness permeating everything. Workers joked with one another, shared cigarettes during breaks, wiped sweat from their foreheads as though assembling military aircraft was simply another day's honest labour. To the Germans, who had been told repeatedly that every German worker was being pressed to the absolute limits of human endurance, this apparent ease proved deeply unnerving. How could a population that seemed so relaxed generate such overwhelming force? O'Brien, noticing their collective awe, leaned closer to the group and said with a broad grin that if they thought this hangar was impressive, they should see Detroit. This facility, he assured them, represented nothing but a drop in a very large bucket. He chuckled and walked away, leaving the women standing in silence amid the mechanical symphony. The paradox hung in the air around them like the smell of aviation fuel. For the Reich, every aircraft lost represented a national tragedy, a blow to morale and capability that could not easily be absorbed. For America, it represented an inconvenience that would be remedied within days through industrial replacement. That single difference alone signaled the inevitable trajectory of the war. As the women were guided back out into the sunlight, the roar of an engine undergoing full-power testing shook the ground beneath their feet with physical force. The sound seemed to follow them onto the buses, reverberating in their bones like an unspoken prophecy. But their education in American military capacity was not yet finished. In the weeks ahead, they would be shown something even more difficult to deny or dismiss. Photographs and detailed reports documenting American bombing campaigns, proving that this industrial power was not merely theoretical or potential. It was already reaching deep into the heart of the Reich with devastating and surgical precision. 3 weeks passed within the rhythm of camp life, a strange suspended state composed of regular meals, medical examinations, and carefully supervised recreational periods. By this point, the German women no longer startled at the sound of American trucks approaching or the sharp bark of orders delivered in English. But the moment that would alter their understanding most fundamentally did not emerge from what they witnessed directly. It came from what they were deliberately shown on paper. One morning, they were assembled in a modest hall where United States intelligence officers spread photographs across long wooden tables. The images were black and white, crisp in their detail, devastating in their implications. They depicted German cities from aerial perspectives, showing factories in their before and after states following bombing raids, rail junctions torn apart like children's toys, synthetic fuel production plants cracked open as though they were nothing more than fragile eggshells. This facility, stated one officer in a measured and emotionless tone as he tapped a photograph showing the Lohner works near Merseburg, produced the majority of Germany's aviation fuel. Or rather, he corrected himself, it used to produce fuel. The adjacent image revealed twisted steel girders, shattered pipelines, and columns of smoke frozen in mid-rise by the camera's shutter. The women leaned over the photographs without speaking. They had been assured by Nazi broadcasts that Allied bombing represented random terror attacks, clumsy and largely ineffective exercises in destruction. Yet here before them lay evidence of something entirely different. Precision, calculation, relentless systematic degradation of industrial capacity. One photograph after another reinforced the same terrible point. A ball-bearing manufacturing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to skeletal ruins. Bridge spans across the Rhine River snapped like matchsticks and collapsed into the water below. Rail yards in Cologne transformed into landscapes of overlapping craters. A prisoner named Marta whispered, almost speaking to herself rather than to anyone else, so that explains why our trains never arrive on schedule anymore. Statistics confirmed what the photographs depicted. By the middle of 1944, Allied bomber formations were dropping more than 200,000 tons of explosives on Germany every single month. Aircraft losses among the attacking forces remained high, but American production capacity, those endless hangars full of bombers they had already witnessed with their own eyes, rendered such losses sustainable. Germany, by contrast, could not replace its fuel refineries or its precision machinery. Every blast crater visible in these photographs represented another wound that could not heal. The sensory impact penetrated even through still images captured on photographic paper. The women studied the jagged white scars of bomb craters against blackened earth, examined the skeletal remains of factories that had once hummed with productive activity. One prisoner wrote in her diary afterward that she could almost smell the smoke rising from the surface of the photographs themselves. What shook them most deeply was the casual manner in which the American officers presented these images. This was not theatre staged for the benefit of the prisoners. This represented routine intelligence analysis, something these officers sifted through on a daily basis as part of their ordinary duties. To the prisoners, each photograph functioned like a dagger thrust into their understanding of the war. To the officers, these were simply reports in an endless stack of thousands requiring evaluation. One officer explained without any trace of malice or vindictiveness that complete destruction was not necessary. Just eliminate the fuel production, the bearing factories, the bridge connections, he stated. When those critical nodes are removed from the system, your armies cannot move regardless of how many soldiers remain. His words carried clinical precision, but to the prisoners listening they carried the weight of mathematical inevitability. Ingrid wrote in her journal afterward that it was not hatred that had defeated Germany. It was arithmetic. The paradox was stark and undeniable. German propaganda had characterized America as reckless and chaotic and incapable of sustained strategic thinking. Yet what the women now examined was evidence of cold and disciplined precision applied across an entire industrial landscape. When the briefing session concluded, the women walked back toward their barracks beneath a sky streaked with vapor trails from aircraft passing overhead at high altitude. For the first time since their capture, they experienced the sensation that even the clouds belonged to the enemy. The Reich had assured them that mastery of the skies was theirs by right of superior technology and fighting spirit. The truth was written in smoke and contrails above their heads, visible to anyone willing to see it. But this new knowledge, this accumulation of evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught, carried with it a moral dilemma that weighed heavily. Should they remain silent, protecting the illusion that their country still desperately clung to? Or should they speak truthfully, risking accusations of betrayal and treason? That question would be brought to a head with the arrival of a letter, a message that would test both their loyalty to the regime and the Americans' willingness to allow truth to circulate freely. The letter arrived one grey afternoon, slipped beneath the door of their barracks like contraband being smuggled past guards. It bore no official postal stamp, only faint pencil markings scrawled across the envelope's surface. Hildegard, the nurse, noticed it first and picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands with suspicion before opening it. When she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, the other women crowded around her like moths drawn irresistibly toward flame. The message had originated from another German prisoner of war camp somewhere else within the United States, smuggled through an informal network of prisoners who had discovered ways to communicate despite official restrictions. The text was brief, composed in hurried German script that suggested it had been written quickly. "Hold firm to your faith," it read. "The Reich is mounting successful counter-offensives on all fronts. New weapons will transform the character of the war. Do not believe what the Americans show you. Victory remains near at hand." The words echoed promises they had heard before their capture, slogans that had been repeated endlessly through official channels. Yet now, after witnessing the harbour and the hangars and the photographs, the sentences rang hollow and desperate. The letter's tone of desperation spoke louder than its proclaimed confidence. Lotta, the radio operator, shook her head slowly and stated that if Germany were truly winning, there would be no need to smuggle such reassurances to them. But Hildegard pressed the paper flat against the wooden table, her brow furrowed with concern. "Still," she observed, "this message reflects what our families are being told back home. What if they believe these claims while we have seen something entirely different?" Tension thickened in the room like smoke. Their lives within the camp had already been shaped by continuous paradox. They were being treated better by their captors than their own regime had treated them during service. They were being fed regularly while their families back home faced starvation rations. They had been shown truths that contradicted the Reich's propaganda at every fundamental level. Now this letter threatened to drag them back into the shadows of enforced belief. That evening, an American lieutenant, one of the officers who had previously shown them the bombing reconnaissance photographs, addressed the assembled women. He held the intercepted letter in his hand, making it clear that camp security had been aware of its existence. "You do not have to believe me," he said in halting but comprehensible German. "But you should understand this fundamental fact. We do not show you fabrications. We have no need to deceive you." He then placed a fresh collection of photographs on the table before them. These images were even more recent than the previous set. Rail depot facilities in Frankfurt reduced to rubble. Columns of smoke rising from Hamburg that appeared to stretch endlessly into the sky. The contrast between the smuggled letter's desperate optimism and the stark documentary evidence could not have been rendered more sharply. For the first time since entering captivity, one of the prisoners who had maintained complete silence for weeks, a woman named Greta, spoke with sudden firmness. "If Germany possesses such miraculous weapons," she demanded, "why do they not prevent this destruction?" She struck the photograph with a trembling finger. The silence that followed her question carried more weight than any guard's command could have imposed. That night, few among them managed to sleep. The sound of distant aircraft engines from a nearby training airfield rolled through the darkness like a persistent reminder of reality. Their dreams, when sleep finally came, were filled with images of smoke and collapsing factories and the nagging, persistent thought that perhaps loyalty had become nothing more than a habit sustained by fear rather than reason. The letter had been intended to reinforce their faith in the regime. Instead, it had created additional fractures in foundations already weakening. The question of what to believe no longer possessed any easy or comfortable answer. And in the weeks that would follow, as American guards began permitting more controlled visits into nearby towns under supervision, the contrast between propaganda claims and observable reality would deepen further until denial became psychologically impossible to sustain. Spring arrived in 1945, bringing with it a peculiar silence. The barracks that had once hummed with rumours and suppressed debates grew progressively quieter with each day that passed. Newspapers, deliberately placed in common areas by American officers who understood their psychological impact, announced the fall of one German city after another in rapid succession. Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt. Each headline represented another nail driven into the coffin of certainty. By April, whispers penetrated even into the isolated world of the German women prisoners. The man they had been forbidden to criticize, the leader whose portrait had hung in every office and school, was dead. The Reich that had proclaimed it would endure for 1,000 years had collapsed in barely 12. The women sat on their wooden bunks, staring at one another across the space between them, unable to reconcile the world they had been raised within against the world they now witnessed crumbling into dust. Ingrid wrote in her diary that they had arrived in America as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule all of Europe. Now, she observed, she could see only that they had been children fed elaborate stories while America had been constructing a reality beyond their comprehension. The United States Army began preparations for prisoner repatriation. The women received clean uniforms issued specifically for the journey, underwent final medical examinations, and were provided with ration packages for the voyage across the Atlantic. Some wept openly at the prospect of seeing family members again after years of separation. Others felt deep apprehension about what awaited them in a defeated and starving Germany. For all of them, the journey home carried a haunting paradox embedded within it. They would be leaving behind comfort and systematic order in the land they had been taught to call the enemy, returning to chaos and deprivation in what remained of their homeland. Before departure, a Red Cross officer approached Ingrid with an unusual proposition. She could carry a message back to Germany, not a personal letter to family, but rather an official report to be delivered to German authorities. Washington had debated the risks involved. Would her testimony be dismissed outright as enemy propaganda designed to demoralize the population? Or might it serve as credible evidence of the absolute futility of continued resistance? Ingrid's account, when she finally composed it, remained brief but unflinching in its honesty. "America's strength is not fabrication or exaggeration," she wrote. "It exists everywhere and in everything. In their machinery, in their factories, in their abundance of food, in their fundamental unity of purpose. To contemplate continuing this war represents nothing less than madness." When the transport ship carrying the repatriated prisoners docked at Bremerhaven, her written report was forwarded up through the chain of command as promised. The reaction from German officers proved entirely predictable. They dismissed her account outright, labeling her either a traitor who had betrayed her nation or a gullible woman who had been seduced by American deception and trickery. The truth she carried was too large and too contradictory to fit within their shrinking ideology. But for the women themselves, the truth they had witnessed could not be erased from memory or consciousness. They had seen aircraft production lines generating replacements faster than combat could destroy them. They had consumed meals more abundant and nutritious than their families could even imagine. They had walked streets in American towns where children played ordinary games without constant fear of air raid sirens. What they carried back across the Atlantic was not simply memory, but comparison, a living contradiction to everything the Reich had promised its people. Years later, some among them would share stories with their children and eventually their grandchildren about that surreal journey into America. They did not speak primarily of humiliation or suffering, but rather of awakening to reality. They recalled with perfect clarity the persistent clanging of shipyard hammers, the endless rows of tanks awaiting shipment, the casual freedom of speech they had overheard in every cafe and on every street corner. These were impressions that no photograph and no propaganda speech could erase from their consciousness. They had departed Germany as prisoners of a regime that proclaimed itself invincible and destined for greatness. They returned as witnesses to that regime's fundamental delusion. And in the final accounting, it was not America's bombs that had unsettled them most profoundly. It was America's abundance, its relentless capacity to create and produce, its absolute refusal to bow before scarcity or limitation. This was not propaganda crafted for their benefit. This was observable reality that could not be argued away. They had imagined themselves arriving as representatives of a superior civilization. They departed as students who had received an education they never anticipated. In the end, America's most devastating weapon proved to be neither its arsenal nor its military might, but rather its living proof that freedom, when combined with industrial capacity and collective will, could outbuild and outlast any tyranny regardless of how powerful that tyranny believed itself to be.